All right. Let me see if I can get my little pointer here. As I recall, we reflected back on the accounts in Daniel, the miraculous things that happened in the book of Daniel in our study Wednesday night. We specifically had spent some time looking at not only the fiery furnace, but also that you had the Daniel thrown into the lion's den. But what we haven't talked about yet is the writing on the wall in Daniel chapter 5. Belshazzar is king by this time, and again, not our purpose in this particular study. That let me get caught up on my PowerPoint here so I don't distract you. Belshazzar is now king. He's referred to as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, not exactly the son, but a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and now on the throne. But he has this rebellious is probably not the right word, because prideful, probably a better word. Rebellious in the sense that he takes those things that are holy and he does something very openly and outwardly as an insult to God and to God's people. The Israelites have been taken into captivity. Again, we don't want to get too bogged down in it, but since we've been through the Bible multiple times from multiple viewpoints, we want to be able to connect those while we're going back through looking at the miracles. But the children of Israel have been disobedient to God, and so he said he's going to send them into captivity, and they're going to stay there 70 years, so they're there. They're in captivity. And Nebuchadnezzar is the one who took them into captivity, and now this descendant of Nebuchadnezzar has come to the throne. When Nebuchadnezzar took them into captivity, he took all the worshipful instruments from the temple, all the holy things that were used in worship to God. And so they evidently have been, part of the booty, part of the conquering treasures, because they're made of gold and silver and those kind of things. And so they've just been there. And Nebuchadnezzar, was prideful himself, but here is Belshazzar, who is going to throw this banquet for his lords, and he takes those golden vessels that were used in the temple to worship God, and he entertains his guests. He serves out of those utensils. And because of that, God displeased. You see, it might look like, from those who really don't know who God is, and they feel like that Judah was conquered just like the other nations, and so anything that was taken was just spoils of war, and so it doesn't mean anything. Now, you would think that Belshazzar would be fully aware that not only did these things come from the temple, but what the temple meant to the Jewish people, and that was a temple to their God. And so there's some level of arrogance to demonstrate, much like what we looked at when we looked at them taking the Ark of the Covenant into the temple of Dagon and placed it there next to it. It was this saying, "Our God conquered your God" kind of thing. So he takes these things that are holy. God designed all those utensils. God told him how to make them. He told him what to make them out of. And so even though his people are in captivity, he's still God. And as long as these things are part of the captivity, God had already promised him after the 7 years they're coming back. And in that interim, you have Belshazzar deciding to show these things off and serve his lords out of these utensils. And it said they drank wine in verse 4, and they praised the gods of gold and of silver and of brass and of iron and of wood and of stone. So this God of Israel, you couldn't really see. You remember the Philistines thought that the ark was their God. And so they're saying, look, these are silver and gold utensils, maybe representing their God, and so we're going to worship our God. And they made lots of God, didn't they? You know, we've already looked at Nebuchadnezzar wanting the 3 Hebrew youth to bow down to the image that he made. So we know their mindset, and so he has this mindset, his gods are successful, they're conquered. And so what represents the God of the Israelites, he uses to serve his lords. And in the same hour, it says in verse 5, came forth the finger of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the walls of the king's palace, and the king saw part of the hand that wrote. And then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosened, and his knees smote together against one another. So all of a sudden he sees immediately something going on here I have no capacity to understand, but it got his attention, didn't it? Here's what appears to be a man's hand, just part of it that he sees, and it's writing on the wall. So we know this is miraculous, isn't it? That's not a normal occurrence. And it gets his attention. The context seems to indicate, we talk about our knees knocking together, don't we? It indicates that's what happened to him, but even more than that, it sounds like he soiled himself. He was so stunned by the imagery of the hand writing on the wall. So what he thought was going to be a celebration and an exhibiting of the pride of his people having conquered all these other nations and showing off all these utensils became something entirely different. And this miraculous context underscores that for us. They've been there, by this time, almost all those 70 years. And Daniel would be, close to 90 years old. Now that's, when they were taken, you remember they were all young men. And in my mind, when I read it, for the most part, I picture Daniel being young. It's just that my first image in Bible class is just these young Hebrew youth. But by this time, he's an aged man. He's been faithful. We're going to talk about that in our sermon this morning, about the faithfulness of God and therefore our faithfulness in return. And so here you have this context. Verse 7 says, the king cried aloud to bring in his astrologers. He doesn't understand this, but he knows this is not normal. This is not natural. And so he's got people who's supposed to be wise, and they deal with astrology and mysterious things. And the Chaldeans and the soothsayers, and the king spake and said unto the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show it me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then came all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known unto the king the interpretation. Again, in the book of Daniel, multiple times, things happen that are not understandable in man's normal context of things. And so the leader, the king, asks for interpretation. What does this mean? And those who are supposed to know what things mean, who's supposed to be the wise in the kingdom, they never can give an answer. They want the king to give them more information so they can make up an answer. But he doesn't know what it means. Here it is written on the wall. He doesn't know what it says. And so he calls all of his wise men to give him an interpretation of that. And then was the king Belshazzar greatly troubled. And the countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of words of the king and his lords, came in the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee. There is a man in the kingdom in whom is the spirit and of the holy gods in the days of thy father. Now you would think, here's the wife going to remind him, there is a man who can give interpretation. he's on the throne now. You'd think he'd be aware of what happened under Nebuchadnezzar's reign, but he doesn't seem to recall that. When he's calling in all the astrologers and wise men, you'd think he'd have heard the stories and he would have been aware of them not being able to answer it before, and there was somebody wise enough to answer. You remember Daniel's interpretation before Nebuchadnezzar about the image of the head of gold and so forth. And so she reminds him of that, and he gave your father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, and was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father the king, say thy father, made master of the magicians and Chaldeans and soothsayers. And so this has already happened before, and here's who gave the interpretation. Daniel. He's still here. Again, he's getting close to 90 years old. So he's been there pretty much the whole time that they were required to be there, because things are about to change. Kingdom's about to change. That is, the ruler in Babylon's about to change. And Nebuchadnezzar has already experienced the wisdom of God's people. He placed him over all the astrologers. You would think that Belshazzar would know that. Sometimes people come to leadership and it's the position that they're after, and they kind of let everybody else take care of everything else. They just want to be sitting in that position, and they're not fully aware of how things work. He doesn't seem to be fully aware of how things work. And usually people who don't catch themselves up on, okay, what does this position entail, and what are my responsibilities, and who do I have who can help me, and who has expertise here, and those who don't go to that effort sometimes are at the mercy of everybody else. And so he seems to just be in a position. He wants to throw the party and have all the lords in and show off all these utensils. And now he's pretty much lost, isn't he? He doesn't know what to do. And his wife has paid attention. You know, there's a little history here. There's somebody in your kingdom. Somebody who has already proven that he has wisdom, and that his God gives interpretation. And he has wisdom unlike any other person who the gods endow with knowledge. And he said, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding and interpreting of the dreams and showing hard sentences and dissolving of doubt were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar, now let Daniel be called, and he will show you the interpretation. Now she's confident, isn't it? There's usually somebody who pays attention. A lot of times it's the women in our lives that pay attention. You know, we're just kind of doing what's next sometimes, and we get past what's next, and we're ready for what's next. And most of the time there's somebody paying attention that says, this is the history of that. Rather than us have to recreate the wheel and go searching again and go through all this superficial, letting your astrologers try to give you an interpretation, not going to work. They're not going to have the ability to do that. But there's somebody who's already been placed over all them who can give that to you. And so you would think the king would have that knowledge, but he may have been given that knowledge and didn't pay attention. He said, and I have heard and seen, let me go back up, verse 13. And then was Daniel brought in before the king. When? After she told him about Daniel. So he brought in before the king, and he spake unto Daniel, art thou Daniel, which are of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out? So now he's connecting the dots, not necessarily because he was up on all the history. And when you're not up on the history, you kind of repeat the history, don't you? Because you don't learn from it. And so he said, are you the Daniel, I've heard about? And now keep in mind, what are the utensils that he ate and drank out of, or was trying to? Well, they came from Jerusalem, from these people. Now he's speaking to one of those people who were brought captive, and he's about to find out he shouldn't have touched those utensils. And so he's asking Daniel, are you the one I've heard about? And he seemed to have just heard about him. And he said, I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and the light of understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. He must not have known it ahead of time. Either was told it and didn't hear it, or really wasn't told it because that wasn't the first thing he thought of. He didn't think of Daniel first, did he? He's going to go through this whole process of getting his astrologers involved. And he said, now the wise men and astrologers have been brought in before me, and that they should read the writing and make known unto me the interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I heard of thee that thou canst make interpretation and dissolve doubts. And if thou canst read the writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with the scarlet and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. For all practical purposes, Daniel already has resided in that position, hadn't he? He's not particularly wild about it. You'll see that, and I'm reminding us of this background because the miraculous context is astounding. God doesn't go to sleep, and just because they've changed king doesn't mean God's plans change. And here's somebody who is taking those utensils that, well, they're captive, and and these utensils, what does that really matter? Because they're going to end up going back to Jerusalem with them, but they will be defiled if he allows Belshazzar to go through with this. God's not asleep. He's paying attention to these things. And when Nebuchadnezzar evidently didn't use the utensils that way. And Daniel answered and said, verse 17, let the gifts be unto thyself, and give thy rewards to another, yet I will read the writing unto the king and make known unto him the interpretation. Daniel doesn't need any kind of riches. What's he doing in Babylon? He's serving the 70-year sentence for all the Israelites who practice idolatry. The God that said, you're faithful, I'll bless you. If you're unfaithful, I'll curse you and send you into that land. Because they were unfaithful, here is a generation of people who had spent their entire adult life in captivity. But Daniel's been okay with that. That just underscores to him that God's faithful. And he doesn't need riches. God's taking care of him at all levels, isn't he? Over and over, we see that example of Daniel having that experience. And so he said, I don't need your riches. I'll go ahead and give you the interpretation. He's not going to like it. Now, Daniel didn't say that. He's not going to like what that hand wrote on the wall. It got everybody's attention. We talked about the miraculous context. It's always to get people's attention. That what they're about to hear is a message from God. And the person who is giving that message is speaking on behalf of God. So the astrologers couldn't do it. All these wise people couldn't give the interpretation. Now here's somebody who's going to speak from the God that Belshazzar just made fun of, who made light of, who showed disrespect to, by using the things out of the holy temple of God. And so he said, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father the kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. You remember we've already been through this, and we'll see it again when before the book closes. But Nebuchadnezzar got puffed up with pride himself, didn't he? Look at my kingdom. Look at all I've done. And so here's Daniel about to give an interpretation, but he reminds this son of Nebuchadnezzar, this descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, of who put Nebuchadnezzar there. God did. So he starts there. Need to get all this cleared up. It's God who's in charge. It's God the reason we're here. And it really wasn't because of y'all's greatness or your power or your might. And it's the majesty and glory in God to be honored. And you've dishonored him. That's what he'll find out. And he said, for the majesty he gave to him, talking about he gave majesty to Nebuchadnezzar to rule, to be his man who would punish his people for their idolatry. And he said, and all people, nations, languages trembled and feared before him, whom he would slew, and whom he would keep alive, and whom he would set up, and whom he would put down. And when his heart was lifted up, so he gives that history. He's going to find out that you didn't pay attention to history. So he rehearses that with Belshazzar, that here's what happened to your father, and here was the outcome of that, and he was made to live like a beast. No, we don't list that as one of those in the study of a miracle, maybe because, people sometimes mentally can get to the point where they do things very similar to what happened to Nebuchadnezzar when he was driven out into the fields and he had to live like an oxen. And he grew this long hair and these long nails, and he ate grass, and the dew fell on him. And so he rehearses that. What did Belshazzar ask for? Give me the interpretation of the writing on the wall. Where does Daniel start? Let me tell you how we got here. Yeah, you did something with these utensils that your father didn't do, but your father was puffed up to pride, and here's what happened. Now, Belshazzar was puffed up with pride. And God didn't let Nebuchadnezzar get away with it, and he's not going to let Belshazzar get away with it. And Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 said, these things that are written aforetime are written for our learning, that we, through patience, comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. You see, sometimes we just don't want to spend any time in the Old Testament. And sometimes, there are certain portions of the New Testament that, I don't like that book, or, it's kind of hard for me to read. And sometimes we just don't spend any time educating ourselves of how God's always dealt with man all through time. In this very crucial time when everybody's attention is, what in the world is written on that wall? Daniel takes time and traces the history of how God has dealt, not only with his people, and how they were brought into here in captivity because of God gave the power to Nebuchadnezzar and to the Babylonians. And he's also already given Nebuchadnezzar what's going to happen after him. He takes time to rehearse that history. Now, don't know how Belshazzar is feeling moment by moment. But if you ever ask a question you urgently want the answer to, and somebody pauses to give you a little history, you think, I didn't ask for the history. Just get to the point. But they may realize, if you don't get the history, we're going to be here again. You're not going to get this. And of course, it's not going to be a time for him to get much anyway. But, so he rehearses with Belshazzar what happened to his father. And verse 22, he says, and thou his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. So he should have known it. Now, you and I have likely read the Old Testament before and know that they were written for our learning, and that God means what he says, both to bless and to curse. But do we really know it? Why are we going through the Bible, multiple times, in different angles so that we know the history? And now when we're applying God's commandments for our lives, to know God means what he says, and he's going to bless us and take care of us if we do what he tells us to do, and he will punish us if we don't. Got to get that right. Now, Belshazzar must have been exposed to that, must have been taught that, but he didn't remember that. So you and I need to make sure we learn that. Since we're talking about miracles, sometimes we just want to cover the miracle and go to the next one, put it back in the context, and everything we've studied over the last 3 years causes our minds to say, this was a significant miracle to draw attention not only for Belshazzar, but why is it written? For our learning. We may think we do things quietly, and we may do little flippant, rebellious things toward God and make jokes about God, or take something that God is considered to be holy and we are trite with it and think God doesn't know. Does he know? He does know. And so we don't live in a time of miraculous, but do we have to have a hand? Stretch out and write something on the wall that we can't understand to get our attention? Or can we have the recorded scriptures of when that did happen and why it happened and what God says? And so he said, you puffed up with pride. You had the history. You had opportunity to know that God doesn't tolerate pride, people being puffed up against Him. You took something holy that belongs to God and you showed disrespect and disdain for it. And he said, and hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. Now he was just throwing a banquet. He owns these utensils, doesn't he? They've been taken from another nation. It's his kingdom, as his lords. It's his banquet, isn't he? Daniel said, no, it's not. The only reason these Jews are under your care is because God placed them here. The only reason you're in the position you're in is because God placed you there. And he said, and they have brought the vessels of the house before thee. That is, you lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and you brought those utensils. Who designed the utensils? Well, God did. How they were made, what they were used for. And so, did God just forget that? No. He does the same thing in our design spiritually in the Lord's church today, and us being those vessels of honor. And if we use ourselves differently than God intended for us to be used, God's going to say, well, they didn't really mean anything by that. Oh, well, no, He's not. They were written for our learning, so listen to what He said. I know I'm taking a little time on this, but sometimes we say, you remember the handwriting on the wall? Woo! I've seen preachers have charts, and I've seen a few since we've had PowerPoint, and it's always this little foggy, you can see the hand, but you can't really see the whole hand, and here's this meany tickle you farsing. What in the world does that mean? Well, we're about to find out. And so, you say, well, you're trying to build up anticipation. That's true. I want us to say, all right, this is a real happening, and it was not natural. Remember we talked about the definition of miracle? It is supernatural. And so there's writing on the wall is something that got this king's attention. And he said, you have brought the vessels of the house before thee, thou and thy lords and thy wives and thy concubines, and have drank wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold and of brass and of iron and of wood and of stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hands thy breath is, and whose are all the ways thou hast not glorified. You have taken these gods that you've made with your own hands out of all these different materials, and you've ignored the God who created all things and whose breath in your body is absolutely dependent. And you've ignored Him. Did He get his attention? Miraculous, not just say, oh, wow. Did you see that? It was to get your attention and say, what you're about to hear. Yes?
In verse 14, he says, I hear the spirits of the gods are with thee. You making it known to
Yep.
him. There ain't no other gods.
Yep, that's exactly right.
These other things that you're talking
That's right.
about, they're just man-made objects, and you're trying to make them into gods. But
So,
why don't they tell you what that writing on the wall is?
That's right.
They're really the gods.
that's an excellent point. Billy Wayne said, when Belshazzar was asking Daniel to take care of this, he said he hears that Daniel has this wisdom that the gods, he makes it plural like all these gods that they're used to, maybe as part of Daniel's wisdom. He has wisdom, but maybe it's like that. And the point is, what's going to be made is, those are not real gods that are made with hands. But the God of Daniel, who's going to give you this interpretation, wasn't made with hands. It wasn't made out of gold and silver and all these things. It was difficult for them, and you can understand that, who grew up with what Billy Wayne described, making gods, images, out of different material to look like they wanted them to look and to mean what they wanted them to mean. And those representatives of God who tell you what they were speaking or what they wanted, these astrologers and these wise people, couldn't give any interpretation. Now, if they were gods, and these people represent those gods, how come they couldn't share what that means?
His daddy had the same problem.
Beg pardon?
His daddy had the same
That's right. His daddy had the same problem, and that kind of underscores. He did, Nebuchadnezzar. He puffed up with pride. He ignored the God of heaven. He thought he built those kingdoms, and he thought his God delivered those things in his hand. And so this isn't new, but you should have learned. That should have been something that you learned. He said, then was the, thou hast not glorified, he said. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and the writing was written. Sent from whom? From the God that you don't know. The God that you ignored. The God that you insulted. The God whose these utensils belong to. The God who these utensils were used to worship him. He sent this hand. And this is the writing which was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. And this is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. You want to know what it means? You're going to know what it means. Tekel, thou hast weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Parsin, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar that they clothe Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. Boy, that was short order, wasn't it? Should have known. Plenty of history here, and you violated that. Now, that goes back to the history he would have known had he paid attention. Nebuchadnezzar saw that image and that head of fine gold. Who was that? That was Nebuchadnezzar, your kingdom. You're the head of fine gold. And then you have this kingdom was represented by the silver, was the Medes and the Persian. So you don't have to wonder. Some kind of vague outcome here. He said, you've lost your kingdom, and I can tell you who you lost it to. And you and I can go back and look at history. Not just biblical history. We can go back and look at secular history, and we can see there was a Babylonian empire, and it was followed by a Medes and Persian empire. So who rules in the kingdoms of men? Well, God does. And so that finger wrote on the wall, and it wrote the message of God on the wall. And Belshazzar didn't know what it meant, and he asked for that to be interpreted. The only one who could interpret it was a man of God. And to demonstrate he was a man of God, that he was a prophet of God, he spoke forth for God, was this miraculous context, supernatural. Now, there's nobody that can give an answer to that, an interpretation of that, unless God gives it to him. When we get to the New Testament context, even Jesus and his miracles, Nicodemus came to him in John chapter 3 and said, Teacher, we know that you're a teacher sent from God, for no man can do these things that thou hast done except God be with him. All these other gods, Billy Wayne mentioned a moment ago, couldn't give an interpretation, couldn't do anything. But the God who's already spoken to Nebuchadnezzar and said, there's going to come a kingdom after you, it's going to remove you, and now all of a sudden it's fulfilled. He was slain that night. If you look at that history, you had the Medes and Persian came in, and here's all this partying going on. Don't forget that. While they're partying, there was a party going on. All the lords have been assembled. And the Medes and Persian had diverted the water from the river, and they floated underneath the walls. The walls were impregnable. You couldn't, they thought they were sitting on this hill, and they had these great walls. You could even drive chariots on the walls. They were so thick, so nobody can get to us. And so they diverted the water so it would be lower enough that they could float underneath the walls. And all of a sudden, party's over. Kingdoms end. Belshazzar's slain. The fascinating thing is, not the purpose of this particular study with the miracles, but the fascinating thing is, guess who's still there? And guess who remains in a position of power? Daniel. You know, in the midst of all this chaos and this upheaval and kingdoms and people getting prideful and falling and wars going on, and who's in charge? Well, God is. So Belshazzar finds that out, and that night he was slain, and Darius the Median took his place, being about 62 years old. New kingdom. Head of gold gone. Not a Medo-Persian. You'll see that being followed out. I want us to spend a little time there, because in our card, just like what wrote on the wall? Well, the finger did. And what did the finger say? I think here's a message from God. You've been weighed in the balances, and you've been found wanting. Did the second bell rung? Huh? No, good. So, if we're weighed, in our mindset, we're coming to worship this morning, we are the vessels of honor that we are to offer ourselves in our worship to God. Are we using those in a holy way, doing what God tells us to do, the way God told us to do it, so we can honor Him? You see, if we alter that or change that, use that in some way, we haven't really learned. And He doesn't have to perform another miracle to say, I mean what I say. and I'm weighing things out. How are you going to handle that? And we talked a little bit Wednesday night about the lion's den, but we hadn't talked about the finger writing on the wall like I need to. I knew I took a little more time on that, but to me that's one of those perfect examples of the miraculous and supernatural. And now God's message is listened to. Got everybody's attention. And what happened? Exactly what God said was going to happen. Yeah. All right. Thank you for your letting me go on and on about that this morning.